I'm not sure that global health governance is, to me, the key question. I think that the key question for me is what is the biggest obstacle to improving global health? And I think there it comes down to a question of resources, and resources both human and financial. And in some ways, the biggest obstacle, it seems to me, is the priorities that national governments have to give to health. That is, there are a number of countries that clearly need and should get considerable international assistance. There are also a number of middle-income countries that have to take much greater responsibility. The African Union has recognised that for Africa and has actually called on African governments to spend much more, which most of them are not doing. There's some interesting examples in this part of the world, such as Thailand, which said from early on it would take responsibility for funding its own HIV programs, and I don't think it's an accident that Thailand therefore has been very successful. And I'm deliberately talking about national governments because I'm not quite sure what global health governance really means, other than a system of improving the flow of resources and the flow of information. I can't see the need for developing some sort of global health structure to govern health. I think we've got to be very careful. There clearly are differences across Southeast Asia because Thailand and to some extent Cambodia have responded far more effectively to HIV/AIDS than other parts of the region. Indonesia now has taken steps forward. I think what's interesting to me about, we're sitting in Singapore, that the richest country in Southeast Asia is also a country in which the stigma around HIV remains very strong. And I think, of course, you're pointing to something that's absolutely true, but not just true in this part of the world, that because of the way in which HIV is spread, which is through sex and through the use of needles, usually by people injecting illicit drugs, that has reinforced the taboos, and those taboos then get perpetuated through religious and cultural stereotypes, and the easy solution is to see HIV as punishment for behaviour that respectable people don't engage in. And I think that as long as those attitudes persist, it becomes very difficult to change the attitudes. And I think what you're pointing to is a real problem now globally that really has only been successfully addressed, I think, in about half a dozen countries. And it's interesting, after all, even in the United States, which is, after all, the source of the great bulk of global resources, financial and research, around HIV/AIDS, there are many parts of the country where you would find exactly the same stigma, where you would find the same denial, and not surprisingly, the United States, despite its role internationally, is of rich countries probably the one with the greatest HIV epidemic. So those taboos, those stigma, cut across cultures, cut across nations, and cut across the division between rich and poor. It's true that in many parts of the region, in many parts of the world, it's been NGOs, civil society and community organisations that have really taken the leadership, and there are some very impressive examples of that in Southeast Asia. In Singapore you've had Action for AIDS, in Malaysia the Malaysian AIDS Council, in Thailand the early work that was done by NGOs around the 100% condom campaign. There are examples really from across the region where there's political space, and not surprisingly we can't find comparable examples from, say, Burma or Vietnam, where there just isn't the political space to organise. I think that the great advantage that those sorts of organisations have is that they can confront the taboos and the religious and cultural teachings, which often perpetuate gender inequality, refusal to talk about sexuality, refusal to acknowledge commercial sex. And of course, one of the things that strikes people who come to many parts of Southeast Asia from overseas is that this is a part of the world in which there is a huge amount of commercial sex, as indeed there is anywhere where there is a lot of economic inequality, and equally huge denial. So that any of us, if we're realistic, know that within 10 minutes we could find commercial sex in any large Southeast Asian city, but there are still government officials who will pretend it doesn't exist, or will say, well, if it exists it's due to foreigners, and it's all due to these nasty people coming from outside, whereas in fact the great bulk of it is indigenous, is local, and is fueled by economic and social inequality. So I think the short answer to what you're asking is greater openness, much better sex education in the schools, and a willingness to confront religious and traditional taboos. And that takes courage, and it's a sort of courage that I'm proud to say I've seen friends and colleagues in this part of the world often take the lead on internationally. And I think that some of the earliest examples of community activism in response to HIV/AIDS has come from movements in this part of the world, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Thailand, and I think we should be very proud of that, because they've done it often in situations of extreme vulnerability and prejudice. I think this is a really interesting and impressive network, and I have to say it's very, very exciting for someone who comes from Australia to sit in a room with people of this calibre from really across the region. And when we talk about the region, because one of the things that always annoys me is when people in the rest of the world talk about Asia, they don't actually realise they're talking about 50 countries, half the world's population, huge distances. And I've just come to Singapore from Europe, and the attitude in Europe is often, oh, you're going to Singapore, you know, maybe you could sort of drop in for lunch at Hong Kong. I mean, I'm quite serious. There is a real lack of appreciation of the size, the population, the diversity and the scale. And so one of the things that the consortium does, by bringing together people working in these very different countries with different levels of economic, political, cultural, religious tradition, is, I think, foster our cooperation, our ability to work together. Now, specifically around issues of health, what has struck me about this consortium is it's reflected the government's interest in certain sorts of respectable epidemics, namely H1N1, SARS, the constant search for the new killer flu. I mean, I think it's very odd to me. We all seem to be still living in the shadow of 1919 with this constant fear that there's going to be a global flu pandemic, which actually has not happened. While at the same time, there's not much attention paid to diseases such as, for example, tuberculosis, which is quite widespread across many parts of Asia, and not nearly enough attention, I think, paid to the diseases of poverty and interconnection between poverty, water and food security, climate change and health. And so I think that the focus in the future really needs to be on how the different sorts of areas of human or non-traditional security, which, as somebody has said in our discussions, often form silos of their own. And I'm very conscious of being part of an HIV/AIDS silo, which is, you know, a big world that's also very inward-looking. I think that's true of people who work in many of these areas. And I think the real challenge is not to say, okay, let's talk more about heart disease or let's talk more about malaria. I think the real challenge is to say, let's talk about how these are all interconnected. Let's talk about how climate change is going to impact upon the health conditions in the countries that are most affected. Let's talk about the way in which the huge inequalities, the global inequalities of wealth, the inequities of trading arrangements, the inequities of human resources as there is a constant brain drain, how all those impact upon health. And that, I think, is the big research challenge for us all, that of course goes far beyond any specific disease.